He sat with his kids and watched his wife get ready for her date to pick her up from their home. She stood in front of the mirror putting on her makeup. Her husband was right there in the living room. So were her kids. And every single one of them knew exactly who she was getting ready for. That is not a scene from a movie. That is a real man describing what he lived through one evening, sitting on his own couch, watching his wife get dolled up for another man while their children sat beside him and witnessed every second of it. I want you to really sit with that image before we go any further. The silence in that room. The way time probably felt like it had slowed down to something unbearable. The children pretending not to understand what was happening while understanding every single bit of it. Let me back up and tell you how this whole situation unraveled, because there is a lot here and you need to understand the full picture to really grasp how unhinged this became. This man is married and has been for 7 years. 7 years is not a small thing. That is nearly a decade of shared meals and shared beds and shared arguments and shared holidays and the kind of mundane intimacy that builds a life. He describes the relationship as abusive, and everything that follows in his story is going to show you exactly why he used that word. They have children together, 2 under 10 years old, and there is also a teenager in the home from her previous relationship. So this is not just a couple falling apart. This is an entire family being dragged through something catastrophic, and every one of those children is going to carry pieces of this night with them for the rest of their lives. It started when she was gone for hours and he asked her a simple question. He asked if she had been at the tattoo place. She said no and just casually dropped a man's name like it was nothing, like she was mentioning a coworker or a neighbor, like it required no explanation whatsoever. She came home drunk that same night, and not quietly either, because she had rear-ended a car just a mile from their house on the way back. She stumbled through the door and passed out. Think about what that night looked like from his perspective. He is already uneasy, already asking questions, already getting answers that do not quite line up, and then his wife comes through the front door unable to stand straight, smelling like a bar, with a damaged car sitting in the driveway. And here is where things take a sharp turn, because she left her phone unlocked. He saw the texts. Not just one conversation. Multiple conversations, running simultaneously, and every single message following the same script. She was telling all of them the same story. She told every man she was talking to that she and her husband were separated, that he was abusive, and that he already knew she was dating around. She was maintaining a carefully constructed lie across multiple people at the exact same time. Picture what that takes. Not a moment of weakness or a single bad decision but an ongoing, deliberate performance. She was managing characters, keeping storylines straight, making sure no thread unraveled. That is not someone who slipped. That is someone who planned. And then, as if that were not enough, he found something that punched him even harder. There was a screenshot. She had taken his response, the message where he said he had no idea who this man was, and she sent it to the man with a caption. She wrote that he knows who you are, even though her husband genuinely did not. She had used his own words, stripped of all context, as some kind of proof of concept for whoever she was talking to. She handed a stranger her husband's private message and used it to perform this whole narrative she had built. Think about how cold that is. Not only is she lying about him to other men, she is actively recruiting his own voice into the lie. She is making him an unwitting participant in his own betrayal. That is not just cheating. That is a calculated, deliberate, ongoing deception that she was actively managing and maintaining in real time. Oh, and she is also sending nudes. To yet another person he has never even heard of before. Not someone from the other conversations. A completely separate individual who exists in a completely separate thread of this web she has been spinning. That detail matters because it tells you this was not one mistake that spiraled. This was a lifestyle she had been quietly building alongside the one her husband believed they shared. He confronted her when he found her phone unlocked the next day with evidence of the nudes right there on the screen. She looked him dead in the face and said no she did not. Then she grabbed the phone. He left to go to the store and came back to find her taking nudes in their bathroom after getting out of the shower, completely unashamed, as though she had decided that the pretense was no longer worth maintaining and she was simply going to do whatever she wanted in broad daylight. She then announced she was going out that night and he already knew who she was going with. What happened next is what has made this story spread across the internet and crack people open. She started getting ready. Right there. In the family home. With her husband and all of her children present. She sat down at whatever surface she used and she opened her makeup and she began. Foundation. Eyeliner. Whatever it takes to transform yourself for someone who is not your spouse. She got dressed in clothes she had clearly chosen with intention. And through every minute of it, the house was silent in that particular way that is not actually quiet at all, that is filled with the sound of everyone holding their breath and trying to decide whether what they are watching is really happening. She made it abundantly clear that she was going out to meet another man and there was nothing anyone in that house could do about it. While she was doing all of this she was talking. Blaming him. Telling him he never gave her enough attention. Insisting she was not having an affair, which at this point was so absurd it almost defied language. Announcing she could not wait to divorce him and take everything, saying it like it was a thing she had been looking forward to, like she had been rehearsing it. Think about what those kids were absorbing in that room. The two younger ones, already confused and scared, sitting in the living room watching their mother get ready to leave with someone else. Children that age do not have the vocabulary for what they are feeling, but they have the instincts. They know when something is deeply wrong. They feel it in their chest before they can name it. The teenager, old enough to understand exactly what was happening, sitting there in silence with the particular stillness of someone who has already learned that the safest thing to do is disappear into yourself. And this man, trying to hold it together for 3 children while his wife blamed him for the destruction she was causing, probably running through every calculation about what to say and what not to say and how to keep the temperature low enough that nobody got hurt. Then it got worse. Right before the man pulled up, she asked the teenager for a hug. The teenager did not want to hug her. And instead of accepting that and walking out the door, she turned it into a scene. She started crying and yelling that nobody had ever loved her. Not her mother, not her father, and now not even this teenager. She was making herself the victim in the middle of chaos she had created, in front of children who were already frightened and overwhelmed. That teenager had to sit there and absorb the weight of being told they were responsible for an adult woman's pain, in a moment that adult woman had manufactured entirely herself. That is an enormous thing to put on a young person. The husband stood up and asked her to leave. That is a sentence that contains so much restraint it almost hurts to read. After everything. After the makeup and the blame and the accusations and the teenager being made to feel responsible for a grown woman's grief. He stood up and he asked. He did not demand. He did not lose himself. He asked. She flipped the coffee table. Everything on it and in it went flying across the room. Whatever had been sitting there, drinks, remotes, whatever families leave on coffee tables, became projectiles in a home with children in it. She kicked a hole straight through the drywall. Think about the sound of that. The crack and crumble of a wall giving way under someone's foot, in a house that was supposed to be safe. Then she hit the desk hard enough to send a glass lamp crashing to the floor where it shattered into pieces. Glass everywhere. Sharp and scattered across the floor of a home with children young enough to not always watch where they step. After all of that, she walked out the door, stumbled over to the car that was waiting for her, got in while the man held the door open like they were going somewhere lovely, and they drove away together. And this father was left standing in his own house, surrounded by broken glass and shattered drywall and 3 traumatized kids, cleaning up the destruction she left behind while she went on her date. I need a second with that because I genuinely cannot process how someone does that. How you look at your children, at the mess you made, at the husband crouching down to pick up shards of glass so nobody gets hurt, and you get into a car and you go. How that is a choice a person makes. How you live inside yourself after making it. He did not crumble though, and that is the part of this story that matters just as much as everything she did. He had already been planning. Long before that night, before the makeup and the coffee table and the shattered glass, he had been quietly and methodically preparing himself for what was coming. He had already scheduled a call with a lawyer for Monday. He had already started documenting everything. That kind of foresight, in the middle of that kind of emotional devastation, is not a small thing. Most people in that situation are barely breathing. He was building a case. And after that night, he made one more critical decision. He started recording. Every single day, for protection. And thank God he did, because the very next day she called the police. She told them he was abusive and tried to get a restraining order against him and take the kids. She did not know about the recordings. She had walked back into that house after everything she had done and assumed the story was still hers to control. She had probably already rehearsed what she was going to tell the officer. She had been rehearsing versions of this story for months. He had video of the entire interaction. He showed it. He got the temporary restraining order against her instead. The very thing she tried to weaponize against him, the narrative of abuse she had been selling to every man in her phone and now to law enforcement, got turned around completely because he had the presence of mind to document reality while she was busy rewriting it. I want you to think about how close that came to going the other way. Without that footage, it is his word against hers, and she had been practicing her version of events for a very long time. He ended his post saying he was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions. Relieved and scared about what comes next. But he also said he contacted a divorce attorney. He is moving. And whatever comes next, he is not standing still. Here is where I land on all of this. What this woman did is not just infidelity. It is a sustained, deliberate campaign of abuse. She used the word abuse to describe her husband to every man she was talking to, and she said it so casually and so consistently that it was clearly a rehearsed tool, something she reached for automatically because it had probably worked before, or because she understood exactly how effective it would be in making her the sympathetic one in every room. She weaponized the language of victimhood to protect her behavior and destroy his reputation with people she was using him to impress. That is a level of calculated cruelty that goes well beyond someone who got lost in a bad situation. The physical destruction she caused on her way out the door matters too, and it should not get minimized just because it was property. She did that with children in the room. She shattered glass with children in the room. She created a dangerous, terrifying environment for 3 kids because a teenager did not want to hug her, and then she walked out and left the mess for her husband to clean up. That is not someone having a breakdown. That is someone who was angry that reality was not cooperating with the story she had constructed, and she punished everyone around her for it. The fact that he kept it together, protected his kids, documented everything, got legal counsel, and ultimately protected himself and his children from her false accusations is extraordinary. He did everything right in a situation designed to make him fail. She tried to use the legal system against him after everything she had done in that house, and it backfired entirely because he had been smart enough to create a record of truth. That camera was his witness when she tried to rewrite the story one more time. This man has a long road ahead of him. Divorce is not simple, especially with children, especially in an abusive dynamic, especially when the other person is willing to lie to police. But he has already taken the most important steps. He knows what he is dealing with. He is getting help. He is protecting his kids. And he got himself out from under the threat she tried to hang over him. Whatever comes next, he showed his children something they will carry with them. He showed them that even when everything is falling apart, you can still choose to be the stable one in the room. That matters more than he probably realizes right now. Final word count, 25-20. A betrayed husband spent 5 years trying to save his marriage, and this is what he needs you to know. He spent 5 years. 5 years of counseling, of disclosures, of rebuilding, of trying. And then he sat down and wrote something that every person standing at this particular crossroads needs to read before they make their decision. This is not a post written in anger. It is not a warning from someone who gave up. It is something rarer and harder to read. It is an honest accounting from someone who genuinely tried, who wanted it to work, who put in the hours and the money and the emotional labor, and who is now standing on the other side of all of that with a clear view of what staying actually costs. He starts from a real place. 6 years ago, he was in the thick of it, a betrayed husband sitting in the dark corners of the internet, searching for something that felt like solid ground, looking for guidance in one of those online communities that forms around shared devastation. The kind of place where strangers type out their worst nights and other strangers read every word because they are living the same night right now. He got advice there, real advice from real people who had already walked the road he was just stepping onto, and it helped him find his footing when everything under him felt like it was crumbling. He lost the account eventually, the way you lose things when life keeps moving and you are just trying to survive it one day at a time, and he could not go back and thank the people who helped him hold on. So instead he wrote this. He paid it forward with everything he learned the hard way, every lesson that cost him something he cannot get back. And what he learned is sobering. He does not tell you to leave. He is very clear about that. He says the decision belongs to you and only you. But he wants you to walk into that decision with your eyes completely open, because the picture that gets painted in those early days of attempted reconciliation is often much softer and more forgiving than what the reality turns out to be. The brochure version of reconciliation is two people choosing each other again. He wants you to know what staying might actually look like, not the hopeful version, but the version that exists on the other side of all the promises, when the promises have to become something real and daily and sometimes exhausting. If you stay, he says, the odds are stacked against you. He describes it as searching for a mythical creature and then tripping over another mythical creature and somehow landing on a genuinely better marriage. The odds of that specific miracle are low, and he is honest enough to say so even though he spent years hoping it would be him. The much more likely outcome, he says, is that you will spend the rest of the relationship walking with what he calls a metaphorical limp. The small physical things, the casual touches that used to feel like nothing because they were just the texture of ordinary life together, the way she leaned into you without thinking about it, the way her hand found yours without either of you noticing, they start to make you flinch. Your body learns a new reflex where it used to know only comfort. And then eventually those touches stop happening at all, because she can feel the flinch even when you try to hide it, and so both of you stop reaching. That is a quietly devastating observation. It is not the dramatic collapse people imagine when they think about a marriage destroyed by infidelity. It is not screaming and thrown dishes and a final door slamming shut. It is the slow erosion of something that used to feel effortless and natural, something you never thought to protect because you never imagined it could disappear. Intimacy does not always die loudly. Sometimes it just gets careful, and careful is its own kind of loss, its own kind of grief that nobody warns you is coming. He talks about disclosure. If you stay, you will ask for the full truth and you will push for it and you will need it the way you need air. But you will never be completely certain you have all of it. You will try to be reasonable about memory. You will remind yourself that human memory is imperfect and that details genuinely do fade with time and that this is a scientific fact. But every single time you hear the words "I do not remember," you will also know, in a place deeper than reason, exactly how convenient that forgetting is for her. She gets to let the details go. You do not get that option. You will remember everything for both of you, every timeline and every name and every excuse, and you will carry that weight forever while she gets to move forward lighter. The sleep thing hit me differently than the rest of it. He writes about the nightmares. He mentions his military service in Afghanistan, in the Shai-Kot Valley, operations that left their own mark on his mind and body in the way that combat always does, in ways that do not fully leave a person even years later. And he says the nightmares from the affair were worse than the ones that came from war. That sentence alone should stop you cold. On the bad nights, he says, the two things blurred together into something he could not separate or escape. Combat and betrayal tangled into the same terrible dream, the gunfire and the deception becoming one shapeless terror that pulled him out of sleep gasping. Even on the nights without the nightmares, he writes, he woke up angry. Not sometimes. Every single morning, to some degree, without exception. That anger waiting for him at the very start of each day like something that had moved into his chest and was not planning to leave. He talks about watching her rewrite the history of the marriage when she speaks to friends and family. He stood there beside her in social situations and said nothing, he writes, because he was too decent to expose her to shame in front of people who loved her, and because he was buried in his own quiet shame about the whole situation. His reputation absorbed hits that hers never did. People looked at him differently in ways they did not look at her. The person who caused the damage somehow escaped most of the social consequences while he absorbed them silently, carrying a weight that was not his to carry, protecting her from a reckoning she had earned. He talks about his career and the years he had invested in building it into something meaningful. He had put in extraordinary work over a very long time. 2 master's degrees and a doctorate, credential after credential, proof of a sustained and serious commitment to a vocation he believed in. Hundreds of hours of preparation for ordination and licensure in his tradition. A floor exam in theology that lasted 5.5 hours of sustained intellectual pressure. He had built something that was supposed to matter for the rest of his life. All of it was rendered effectively meaningless because no church in his tradition would place a man in his situation in a leadership role, and the secular job market does not know what to do with a resume built entirely around pastoral credentials. The affair did not just cost him his marriage and his peace of mind. It restructured his entire professional life, closed doors he had spent years carefully opening, and took from him years of work that cannot be recovered or given back. Then he tells you about the triggers. You figure out most of them eventually, he says, through painful and repetitive experience. Her car. Her hairdryer. Her jacket hanging on the hook by the door. Her watch on the bathroom counter in the morning. So many ordinary objects, things that should mean nothing, that your nervous system has connected to the worst information it ever received. You spend months learning tools and therapy, spending real money every week, doing real work on yourself, and it genuinely helps. You get better at managing it. But then one evening she gets home late from somewhere, and you see her standing on the porch framed in the window with the light behind her, and it hits you in a way you were not prepared for. She is a trigger too. The person you are trying to reconcile with, the person whose hand you are trying to learn to hold again, has become a source of anxiety in their own right. That is the thing nobody tells you going in, because it sounds too bleak to say out loud. And then there is the moment that I think is the darkest part of the whole piece. At 42 years old, after everything, he is diagnosed with autism. His wife comes with him to the assessment. They are still doing the work together at that point, still showing up to the appointments, still trying. They are in marriage counseling and have been for a long time. And then during one of those sessions, she takes the diagnosis and uses it. She blames her affairs on his autism, on his neurology, on the way his brain is wired rather than on any choice she made with full knowledge and full agency. The marriage counselor, instead of naming what was happening and pushing back on it, turns to him and asks him how he thinks his autism contributed to his wife's affair. After 5 years of effort and pain. After thousands of dollars spent in rooms like that one. After a strict and devastating accounting of every single thing this experience had cost him. He walked away from that marriage and then had to live with being seen by some people as the one who quit. That is not a man who gave up. That is a man who finally ran out of reasons to keep absorbing. He closes the piece with something that struck me as genuinely generous and hard to fake. He says he is not trying to convince anyone to leave. He says clearly that he is not anti-reconciliation, because he spent 5 years genuinely trying to make it work and he knows what that commitment looks like from the inside. He wishes every person who chooses to stay the genuinely better marriage that people dream of when they decide to reconcile. And he wishes every person who walks away the freedom and restoration they deserve. He is in everyone's corner. He just wants you to know what one possible outcome looks like, because he lived it all the way to the end. Here is my take, and I am not going to soften it. What this man describes is not a failure of reconciliation. It is a documentation of what happens when one person does all the work and the other person never truly reckons with what they did. The autism blame during marriage counseling is the moment that tells you everything you need to know about how much genuine accountability was present in that relationship. 5 years in, after all that work and all that cost, the explanation she reached for was his neurology. Not her choices. Not her behavior. His brain. Reconciliation is not impossible. But it requires something that is genuinely rare, which is an unfaithful partner who is willing to hold the full weight of what they did without deflecting, without minimizing, and without turning it around on the betrayed spouse when the pressure gets high. What this man describes is a process where the betrayed person kept doing the work while the person who caused the damage kept finding ways to redistribute the blame. That is not reconciliation. That is just a different form of the same dynamic that caused the damage in the first place. If you are sitting with that decision right now, this post is not meant to make it for you. But you owe it to yourself to read it and really hear what he is saying. The best case outcome of staying requires a specific kind of person on the other side of the table. Before you commit to the work, look hard at whether that person is actually there. Not the person they are promising to become. The person they are showing you right now, in how they handle accountability, in whether they can hold the truth without flinching, in whether they are fighting for the marriage or just fighting against the consequences of what they did. That difference is everything. Let me know in the comments which story hit you harder today, and if this kind of content means something to you, a like and a subscribe go a long way.